This 1914 portrait of a typist looks modern until you notice the clock card. At first glance, there is nothing unusual about the photograph. A young woman sits behind a gleaming black typewriter, her posture upright, her hands poised over the keys. Her dress is crisp, her hair is neatly pinned. She looks competent, dignified, like a woman stepping into a new century of professional possibility. Then one detail refuses to stay in the background. Margaret Rourke had been cataloging photographs for the Labor History Collection at a university archive in Atlanta for nearly 9 years when she pulled the image from a donation box in March of 2019. The collection had arrived from the estate of a retired businessman whose family had deep roots in Georgia industry. Hundreds of photographs, most of them unremarkable. Factory floors, ribbon cuttings, men in suits shaking hands, the usual visual self-congratulation of early 20th century commerce. But the typist photograph stopped her. The woman in the image was black. That alone was notable for a portrait of this quality from 1914, especially one framed and preserved with such care. The composition was professional. The lighting was deliberate. Someone had wanted this image to look impressive, modern, aspirational. Margaret adjusted her magnifying glass. The typewriter was a Remington Standard, popular in offices of the era. The desk was polished wood. Behind the woman, a window let in soft diffused light, the kind photographers arranged with muslin curtains. Everything about the scene said progress, education, opportunity, except for one thing. In the lower right corner of the frame, barely visible against the dark wood of the desk, sat a small rectangular card. It was slotted into a metal holder, the kind used for industrial time tracking. A clock card. The type punched by factory workers at the start and end of each shift, logging hours to the minute. A professional typist in a modern office would not have had a clock card on her desk. Clerical workers of that era, especially those posed for formal portraits, were salaried. Their time was not tracked by punch clocks. That system belonged to factories, mills, laundries, and labor camps. Margaret turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a single line: Briarfield Industrial Training School, Macon County, 1914. She had never heard of the Briarfield Industrial Training School, but she recognized the naming convention. Industrial training in the Jim Crow South rarely meant what it claimed. She set the photograph aside and opened her laptop. This was not just a portrait of a typist. Something here was wrong. Margaret Rourke had come to archival work through a winding path. She had studied history as an undergraduate, then spent a decade in nonprofit communications before returning to academia for a master's in library science. By the time she joined the university's special collections department, she was 42 years old and had learned to trust the slow accumulation of evidence over the quick conclusions that made for good headlines. She had handled thousands of photographs from the early 20th century. Formal portraits, candid snapshots, institutional records. She knew how to read the language of pose and prop, the way a photographer's choices could reveal what the subject wanted to project and what they wanted to hide. She knew that the most interesting photographs were often the ones where those two impulses collided. The typist portrait was one of those photographs. She removed the print from its cardboard backing with a thin metal spatula, careful not to touch the emulsion. The paper was heavy, the kind used for presentation prints. On the back, beneath the penciled notation about Briarfield, she found a small, embossed stamp, Crenshaw Studio, Montgomery. That was something. A studio name meant a photographer, and a photographer meant records. She also noticed, now that the print was free of its backing, a second inscription. This one was fainter, pressed into the paper with what looked like a stylus rather than a pencil. 4 digits. 0847. A number. An identifier. The kind of mark that institutions use to track inventory. Margaret photographed both inscriptions, then slid the print into an acid-free sleeve. She would need to find out what Briarfield Industrial Training School actually was, who attended it, and why someone had posed one of its students or inmates behind a typewriter with a clock card on the desk. She suspected she already knew the general shape of the answer, but the specifics would take time. The first searches turned up almost nothing. Briarfield Industrial Training School did not appear in the standard databases of Georgia educational institutions. It was not listed in the State Archives Index of Public Schools, nor in the directories of private academies that served black students during the Jim Crow era. Margaret found no mention of it in the histories of Macon County she pulled from the library's Southern collection. But she did find Crenshaw Studio. The Montgomery City directories from 1910 through 1922 listed William D. Crenshaw as the proprietor of a photography business on Dexter Avenue. He appeared in the 1900 and 1910 censuses as a white man, born in Alabama, occupation photographer. His studio advertised in the Montgomery Advertiser, offering portraits, group photographs, and commercial work for businesses and institutions. One advertisement from 1912 caught Margaret's eye. Crenshaw Studio offered special rates for institutional documentation, including reform schools, training facilities, and charitable homes. The ad promised dignified images suitable for annual reports and fundraising materials. Reform schools, training facilities. The language was vague, but Margaret knew what it often meant in practice. She requested the Crenshaw Studio collection from the Alabama Department of Archives and History. While she waited, she reached out to Dr. Leonard Hayes, a historian at a research university in North Carolina who specialized in carceral labor systems of the post-Reconstruction South. She had consulted him before on a project involving photographs from a turpentine camp. He responded within a day. "Briarfield," he wrote, "is not a name I recognize, but the pattern you're describing is familiar." There were dozens of so-called training schools and reformatories across the Deep South in the early 20th century that functioned as labor camps for black women and girls. They operated in a legal gray zone, sometimes under the authority of county courts, sometimes as private enterprises leasing inmates from the state. Many of them produced promotional materials that emphasized vocational training and moral uplift. The reality was usually quite different. He attached a PDF of a journal article he had co-authored in 2015. The article focused on a facility in South Carolina, but the structure it described was consistent. Young black women, often arrested on minor charges like vagrancy or incorrigibility, sentenced to indefinite terms at institutions that claimed to provide education but actually operated as laundries, sewing shops, or domestic service placements. The women's labor was contracted out to white households and businesses. Their wages, if any, were garnished to pay for their training and room and board. Many of them never saw a classroom at all. The clock card on the desk suddenly made more sense. Margaret returned to the photograph. The young woman's posture was perfect, her expression calm and focused. She looked like someone performing competence for an audience. But now Margaret noticed something else. The woman's left hand, the one not resting on the typewriter keys, was positioned strangely. Her fingers were curled inward, pressed against her palm, as if she were gripping something small and flat, or as if she were hiding something from the camera. Margaret zoomed in on the high-resolution scan she had made. The woman's hand was partially obscured by the angle of the shot, but there was a faint rectangular shape visible between her fingers. It could have been a folded piece of paper. It could have been nothing. But combined with the clock card, combined with the institutional numbering on the back, combined with the name of a training school that seemed to have vanished from the historical record, it felt like evidence of something that the photograph's original purpose had been designed to conceal. The Crenshaw Studio collection arrived 3 weeks later on a thumb drive containing over 2,000 digitized images. Most of them were exactly what Margaret had expected: formal portraits of white families, wedding photographs, images of storefronts and factories and civic buildings. But tucked into a folder labeled Institutional Contracts 1908 to 1918 were 47 photographs from facilities across central Alabama. 12 of them were from Briarfield Industrial Training School. The images showed young black women in various poses of productive labor: sewing machines, laundry tubs, ironing boards, a kitchen, a cleaning station with mops and buckets arranged in neat rows, and 3 photographs of what appeared to be a typing classroom, with rows of identical desks and identical typewriters and identical young women in identical dresses. The typist from the donated photograph appeared in 2 of the group shots. She was in the back row of one image, her face partially turned away. In the other, she stood at the edge of a line of women posed before a large brick building. Margaret matched the dress, the hairstyle, the posture. It was the same woman, but it was the group photograph setting that made Margaret's breath catch. The brick building behind the women had barred windows. The ground around it was bare red clay, scraped clean of grass. To the right of the main structure, partially visible, was a smaller building with a tall chimney. The architecture was unmistakable. It was a laundry facility, industrial scale, the kind that processed linens for hotels and hospitals and wealthy households across the region. Margaret called Dr. Hayes. "That's consistent with what I've seen from other sites," he said. "These places positioned themselves as schools, but the actual instruction was minimal. The women worked 10 to 12-hour days. Some of them were as young as 14. The Typist portrait you found was almost certainly made for promotional purposes, to show donors and state officials that the facility was providing real vocational training. The reality was that typing instruction, if it existed at all, was reserved for a handful of women who could be displayed in photographs. The rest worked in the laundry." Margaret asked about the clock card. "Time tracking was ubiquitous in these facilities," Dr. Hayes explained. "The women were paid nothing, but their labor was meticulous documented. The clock card served two purposes. First, they allowed the institution to invoice the businesses that contracted for laundry services. Second, they created a paper trail that could justify extending a woman's sentence if she was deemed insufficiently productive. Miss a quota, and your release date could be pushed back months or even years." The young woman in the portrait had not been posing as a professional typist. She had been posing as evidence of rehabilitation, of progress, of the benevolent transformation of a wayward girl into a useful member of society. The clock card on her desk was a prop, meant to suggest modern efficiency. But it was also, Margaret now understood, a symbol of the surveillance and control that defined every hour of her life inside those walls. And the object in her hand? Dr. Hayes had a theory about that too. There are documented cases of women in these facilities passing messages to family members or to lawyers working with civil rights organizations, he said. Some of them managed to smuggle out written accounts of conditions inside. If she was holding a folded piece of paper, it's possible she was using the photography session, the one moment when she was positioned near a desk with writing materials, to conceal something she intended to pass along. Margaret stared at the photograph. The woman's eyes, she realized, were not quite meeting the camera. They were focused on something just to the left of the lens, as if she were looking at someone standing beside the photographer, someone who might have been able to receive whatever she was holding. The records of Briarfield Industrial Training School surfaced in fragments over the following months. Margaret found a reference to the facility in the minutes of the Macon County Board of Commissioners from 1907. The board had approved a lease arrangement with a private company called the Southern Uplift Association, which proposed to establish a reformatory for colored females on a tract of land outside the town of Notasulga. The lease granted the association use of county prisoners sentenced on misdemeanor charges in exchange for a per capita fee paid to the county treasury. The Southern Uplift Association was incorporated in Montgomery in 1906. Its founding board included 2 state legislators, a prominent cotton broker, and the owner of a chain of commercial laundries that served hospitals and hotels across Alabama and western Georgia. The company's stated mission was to provide moral and industrial training for wayward Negro girls, preparing them for useful lives of service. Dr. Hayes connected Margaret with a legal historian at Howard University, Professor Diane Okafor, who had spent years researching the post-Reconstruction labor systems that operated between formal slavery and formal freedom. She called the system Margaret was uncovering shadow peonage. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as punishment for crime, Professor Okafor explained. That exception created an enormous loophole. Southern states passed vagrancy laws, loitering laws, laws against disorderly conduct and incorrigibility that were enforced almost exclusively against black people. Once convicted, prisoners could be leased to private companies. The reformatory system for women and girls operated on the same principle, but with an added layer of paternalism. The facilities claimed to be rescuing fallen women. In practice, they were extracting labor from people who had often committed no real crime at all. Margaret asked what kinds of offenses sent young women to places like Briarfield. Anything, Professor Okafor said. Walking alone after dark, being in the company of a man who is not a relative, talking back to a white employer, having a child outside of marriage. Sometimes no offense at all, just a county official deciding that a girl was in moral danger and needed to be removed from her family. The sentences were indeterminate, which meant the institution could keep a woman as long as they claimed she wasn't reformed. The commercial laundry connection made sudden, brutal sense. Laundry work was one of the few forms of paid employment available to black women in the early 20th century South. Many of them worked independently, taking in washing from white households and keeping the earnings for themselves. The reformatory system allowed white business owners to undercut that independence. Why pay a free woman to wash your linens when you could contract with an institution that provided the same labor for a fraction of the cost, performed by women who could not leave and could not complain? Margaret returned to the Crenshaw studio photographs. In the image of women standing before the brick building, she counted 32 figures. 32 women whose labor had been extracted under the guise of moral improvement, whose earnings had been siphoned to county coffers and private shareholders, whose sentences could be extended at the whim of administrators who profited from their confinement. And one of them had tried to hide something in her hand during the one moment when the camera was pointed at her. The identity of the woman in the portrait took another 4 months to establish. Margaret worked backward from the institutional number on the photograph, 0847. She eventually found a partial intake ledger from Briarfield in a collection of county records that had been donated to a local historical society in the 1970s. The ledger covered 1912 through 1915 and listed inmates by number, name, age, county of origin, and offense. Number 0847 was Celia Ann Woodson, age 19 at intake, from Russell County. Her listed offense was incorrigibility. The ledger noted that Celia had been committed to Briarfield on the petition of the Russell County Juvenile Court in March of 1913. No family members were listed. No release date was recorded. Margaret searched for Celia Woodson in census records, draft registrations, marriage indexes, death certificates. She found a Celia Woodson in the 1910 census, living with her mother and 2 younger brothers in Phoenix City, Russell County. The mother, Loretta Woodson, was listed as a washerwoman. Celia, then 16, had no occupation recorded. There was no Celia Woodson in the 1920 census anywhere in Alabama. Margaret reached out to genealogical organizations that specialized in African American family history. She posted queries in regional Facebook groups. She contacted the Russell County Historical Society. For weeks, there was nothing. Then, in late November, she received an email from a woman named Deborah Simmons in Columbus, Georgia. "I think you're asking about my great-aunt," Deborah wrote, "my grandmother's oldest sister, Celia. She disappeared when my grandmother was a little girl. The family was told she died at a reformatory, but they never got the body. My grandmother talked about her sometimes. She said, Celia was stubborn and wouldn't let anybody tell her what to do. She said that's why they took her." Margaret called Deborah the next day. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Deborah's grandmother, Mary Woodson Carter, had passed away in 2006 at the age of 94. But she had talked about Celia throughout her life, and Deborah had recorded several of those conversations in the early 2000s as part of a family history project. The recordings were rough, captured on a handheld tape recorder, but the voice was clear. "They came and got her one day," Mary Carter said in one recording. "Mama wasn't home, men in a car. They said Celia had been seen with some boy and she was going to be made proper. Mama went to the courthouse the next week and they told her Celia was already at the training school and she couldn't visit. She wrote letters, but nobody ever wrote back." Deborah sent Margaret a photograph from the family collection. It showed 2 young girls, maybe 8 and 10 years old, standing in front of a wooden house. The older girl had her arm around the younger one's shoulders. The posture was protective, almost defiant. "That's Celia on the left," Deborah said, "and my grandmother on the right. It's the only picture we have of her from before." Margaret compared the photograph to the Typist portrait. The face had aged from childhood to young adulthood, but the set of the jaw was the same. The directness of the gaze was the same. Even the slight tension in the shoulders, as if bracing for something, was the same. Celia Ann Woodson had been 19 years old in 1913 when the county decided she was incorrigible. She had been posed behind a typewriter in 1914 as evidence of her reformation. And sometime after that, she had vanished from the records entirely. Margaret brought everything she had found to the archives director in January of 2020. Dr. Patricia Holden was a careful administrator, protective of the collection's reputation and wary of controversy. She listened to Margaret's presentation without interruption, flipping through the printed photographs and ledger excerpts, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When Margaret finished, Holden was quiet for a long moment. "This is significant," she finally said, "and it's the kind of story that could generate attention, both positive and negative. Before we do anything public with this material, I want to make sure we've verified everything independently. I also want to consult with legal about the privacy implications of identifying the woman in the photograph." Margaret pushed back. "She's been dead for at least 70 years. Her family wants to know what happened to her. The privacy concern isn't about protecting Celia, it's about protecting the reputation of the families who ran the Southern Uplift Association." Dr. Holden's expression tightened. "That's not what I said." "No," Margaret agreed, "but it's what the hesitation is about. The cotton broker on the founding board was Charles D. Merritt. His great-granddaughter is on the university's board of trustees. I checked." The meeting ended without resolution. Dr. Holden said she would review the materials further and consult with the university's communications office. Margaret returned to her workstation and began drafting a research paper on her own time. 2 weeks later, she received an email from Dr. Holden asking her to suspend public outreach about the Briarfield materials until a formal review could be completed. The email cited concerns about narrative accuracy and contextual framing. Margaret forwarded the email to Dr. Hayes and Professor Okafor. She also sent it to a journalist she had met at a conference on archival ethics. Then she called Deborah Simmons and asked if she would be willing to speak publicly about her family's history. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," Deborah said. The story broke in March of 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning to shut down public institutions across the country. The timing was both terrible and, in a strange way, clarifying. With the university closed and the archive inaccessible, the usual bureaucratic slowdowns simply did not apply. Margaret worked from home, communicating with journalists and historians and descendants through video calls and encrypted email. The article, published in a national magazine that had agreed to a long-form investigation, traced the history of Briarfield Industrial Training School from its founding in 1907 to its quiet closure in 1923. It documented the labor contracts with commercial laundries, the per capita payments to county governments, the indeterminate sentences that kept women working for years. It named the founders and shareholders of the Southern Uplift Association. It included photographs from the Crenshaw Studio collection, including the portrait of Celia Woodson, and it included Celia's voice, as best Margaret and her collaborators could reconstruct it. The folded paper in Celia's hand had never been found. But Dr. Hayes, in his research on similar facilities, had uncovered a collection of smuggled letters at a civil rights archive in Tennessee. Several of them had come from women incarcerated at Alabama reformatories in the 1910s. One letter, unsigned but postmarked from a town near Notasulga, described conditions that matched the Briarfield photographs exactly. 12-hour days in a laundry, meager food, punishments for failing to meet quotas, women who arrived healthy and left broken, if they left at all. The letter ended with a line that Margaret quoted in the article. "They call this a school, but we do not learn anything except how to be worked to death. Whoever reads this, please tell somebody. We are not criminals. We are just colored, and that is the only crime they need." There was no way to prove that Celia had written the letter, but the timing aligned, the details aligned, and the defiance in the words matched the defiance in the photograph. The woman who had refused to look directly at the camera, who had hidden something in her hand, who had used the one moment of visibility to record her own testimony. Deborah Simmons traveled to Atlanta in the fall of 2020, once the archive had partially reopened. Margaret met her at the entrance and walked her through the climate-controlled storage rooms to the table where the Crenshaw photographs were laid out. Deborah stood in front of the Typist portrait for a long time without speaking. "She looks tired," she finally said. "Even with the nice dress and the fancy typewriter, you can see it in her shoulders. She's holding herself up by sheer will." Margaret pointed to the clock card in the corner of the frame. She explained what it meant, how the time tracking had been used to extend sentences, how the photograph had been created to make brutality look like opportunity. Deborah nodded slowly. "My grandmother always said Celia was stubborn. She said that's what got her taken away, and that's probably what killed her. She wouldn't bend. The archive, after months of internal debate and external pressure, had agreed to build a small exhibition around the Briarfield materials. The Typist portrait would be displayed with a full contextual panel explaining who Celia was, how she came to be at the facility, and what the photograph had been designed to conceal. Deborah had been invited to write a statement from the family's perspective. She had brought a draft with her. Margaret read it while Deborah walked through the rest of the photographs. Celia Ann Woodson was my grandmother's big sister, the statement began. She was taken from her family in 1913 because the county decided she was incorrigible. That word meant she had opinions. It meant she didn't stay quiet when she was supposed to. It meant she was a young black woman in Alabama who refused to act like she was less than anybody else. They put her in a place they called a school, and they worked her in a laundry until she disappeared from the records entirely. We never found out what happened to her. We never got to bury her. This photograph is the only image we have of her as an adult. For 100 years, it sat in somebody's collection as proof that the system was helping people like her. Now we know what it really shows. It shows my aunt being used. It shows her labor being stolen. And if you look closely, it shows her trying to fight back, even when she was surrounded by people who wanted her to smile and pretend everything was fine. Celia didn't pretend. That's what I want people to remember. Margaret set the draft down. Deborah had returned and was standing beside her looking at the Typist portrait again. "Do you think she got the message out?" Deborah asked. "The thing in her hand?" Margaret considered the question. "I think she tried. I think the letter we found might have been hers or someone like her. And I think even if it didn't get out then, it's getting out now," Deborah touched the edge of the protective sleeve, not quite touching the photograph itself. 100 years late, she said. "But not too late to matter," Margaret replied. The exhibition opened in February of 2021. It was small, just one room, with 12 photographs and a wall of contextual text and a video station where visitors could hear excerpts from Mary Carter's recordings about her sister. The Typist portrait hung at the center, lit from above, the clock card clearly visible in the corner of the frame. The local response was mixed. Some visitors thanked the archive for telling a story that had been hidden too long. Others complained that the exhibition was divisive, that it focused too much on historical grievances, that it made the region look bad. One donor, a descendant of the cotton broker Charles Merritt, withdrew his annual contribution and sent a letter calling the exhibition an attack on a good family's legacy. Dr. Holden showed Margaret the letter. Margaret shrugged. "The legacy is what it is," she said. "We didn't make it. We just stopped pretending it was something else." The exhibition ran for 6 months. It was covered by regional newspapers, a podcast on Southern history, and a documentary crew that was researching a broader project on convict labor. Deborah Simmons was interviewed for several of the pieces. She told the same story each time, the story her grandmother had passed down, the story of a sister who vanished and was never explained. In the final weeks of the exhibition, Margaret received a package from a genealogical researcher in Montgomery. Inside was a photocopied death certificate from the Macon County Records Office. It recorded the death of a woman named Celia Woodson on April 17, 1919, at Briarfield Industrial Training School. The cause of death was listed as exhaustion following influenza. She was 25 years old. The researcher had also found a burial record. Celia had been interred in an unmarked grave on the grounds of the facility. When Briarfield closed in 1923, the land was sold to a timber company. The cemetery, such as it was, had never been maintained. It was now part of a pine plantation, the graves invisible beneath decades of forest growth. Margaret forwarded the documents to Deborah. The phone call that followed was long and mostly silent. When Deborah finally spoke, her voice was steady. "At least we know now," she said. "At least somebody wrote her name down, even if it was just to say she died. That's more than my grandmother ever had." Old photographs are not neutral. They are arguments, made with light and pose and prop, about what deserves to be remembered and what deserves to be forgotten. A portrait of a young black woman at a typewriter in 1914 was an argument that the system confining her was benevolent, that her labor was training, that her captivity was rehabilitation. The clock card on the desk was supposed to prove efficiency and order. Instead, it proves control. This was not an isolated case. Archives across the South hold thousands of similar images, posed portraits of incarcerated people meant to demonstrate reform, promotional photographs of labor camps disguised as schools, images of children in institutions that claim to save them while extracting their work. The visual language is consistent: clean clothes, orderly settings, faces turned toward the camera with expressions carefully managed by photographers who knew exactly what story they were being paid to tell. But sometimes the people in those photographs left their own marks. A hand position that conceals something, an eye line that refuses to meet the lens, a small object that should not be there, that does not fit the narrative, that waits 100 years for someone to notice and ask what it means. Celia Ann Woodson was buried in an unmarked grave beneath pine trees that have since been cut and replanted multiple times. Her body is lost, but her photograph remains, now reframed, now explained, now carrying the story she was not allowed to tell when the camera clicked. The next time you see an old photograph in a museum or a textbook or a family album, look at the details. Look at what seems out of place. Ask who arranged this image and why. Ask who is performing and who is watching. Ask what the person in the photograph might have wanted to say if they had been allowed to speak. The evidence is often there. It just takes someone willing to see it.